Hey everyone. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the major sociological theories, and that is functionalism. Now, previously we spoke a bit about conflict theory and some of its underlying assumptions about the nature of society. In conflict theory, there's this belief that society is something like a battlefield in which different groups compete for a limited set of resources. Functionalism takes a very different point of view on what society is and does. So let's talk a little bit about it. Now, in order to get into this, I think it's worth trying to take on the conflict theory hypothesis. Conflict theory claims that society is a realm of conflict and struggle. What we see everywhere and what we see manifest in the various social institutions and cultural norms and all of the different political structures that influence our way of life is a set of competing groups that are fighting against one another and trying to seize control over the things that have value. And I encourage you to take this perspective very seriously. Right? Look at the world around you, think about the world that you've lived in over the course of your life, and ask yourself, does this ring true? Does this seem like what's been happening? Does it seem like I'm living in the midst of a battlefield? Alternatively, do you look around you, do you gaze back on the things that you experienced throughout your life and see far more examples of cooperation compared to conflict? I don't want to answer that question for you, but I want you to just think about this, right? Weigh these two different perspectives. Which one seems like a more compelling and accurate account of the fundamental nature of social phenomena? Now, what we find within functionalism is a belief that economics does not sufficiently explain everything that we see. This is kind of the orthodox Marxist perspective, right? In Marx's view and in the view of Marxist philosophers, social features and institutions and cultural productions are all just a superstructure on top of the economic root. The foundation of everything, according to the Marxist point of view, is economics. That is a struggle for control over material riches and wealth. This seems a little bit limiting, right? Surely there are some things about our existence that can't really just be boiled down to a desire to attain more stuff or to get more wealth. That doesn't really seem correct. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, isn't there anything about our social institutions that actually serves our needs? When we look around and we look at our schools or our governments or our media institutions or anything, don't they give us anything back? Are they really just taking away from us? Are they really just tricking us all the time? That may be the case, but it certainly seems like at least some of the time they give us something meaningful. This is where functionalists like Emile Durkheim step in. Durkheim's perspective is this, that within the modern era, no individual is self-sufficient. Individuals can't provide everything that they need for themselves, right? Perhaps at some point in the past, individuals or families or family groups could really provide all of the material things and cultural things and everything else that humans need in order to survive and thrive. That's not really the case in industrial society. Right? Since at least the Industrial Revolution, if not earlier, if not since the initial agricultural revolution in the Neolithic period, we've been living in situations in which individuals can't really do it all. There is a division of labor. Right? My job is not to obtain the food that I need to eat. My job is not to build the houses that I end up living inside of. I have other tasks to perform. I rely upon other people to get that food, to build those shelters on my behalf. So Within this context, where no individual or no family group is able to provide everything for themselves, we depend upon society to provide for us, at least to some degree. This is Durkheim's suggestion about what society ultimately is. His claim is that it's not akin to a battlefield, as conflict theorists like Marx would believe, but rather more like a body. Right? Within a single body, there are many different organs, there are many different cells. Each of them has a slightly different job, and each of them depends upon the rest in order to function. Right? It's not possible just for the brain, even if we think the brain as being like the boss of the body, the brain can't live by itself. Right? It depends upon all of the other organs to function in order to work. So Durkheim's claim is essentially that within a society, we're not constantly competing against one another. At some level, at least, we're all in this together. His suggestion is that people generally work together for a collective benefit, and that most of our actions in daily life have collective causes. We feel that as individuals, we're choosing to do X rather than Y. But in fact, a lot of the things that we do throughout the day, going to our job, consuming various forms of media, giving calls to our family and friends, things like this, these actually, in Durkheim's view, have collective causes. Right? We're not at complete individual liberty to do whatever we want. His suggestion is that our behaviors are primarily caused by what he calls the collective conscience. This he defines as the totality of beliefs and sentiments that are common to average citizens of the same society. Now, of course, within a given society, not everyone believes the same things or values the same things or acts in the same way. But Durkheim's suggestion is that there's at least some sort of baseline, some sort of envelope within which most individuals' beliefs and feelings and values and behaviors fall within. Now, it's trying to understand what these collective causes are. It's trying to unpack what this collective conscience is composed of that Durkheim believes sociology should do. This is what its task should be. His claim is that the target of sociological inquiry, the object of its investigation, should be what he calls social facts. These are defined as manners of acting, thinking, and feeling external to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. In other words, there are things which are real, which have some sort of objective existence, but which exist outside of any individual person. You can think of one example of this as being something like credentialization, right? The need to have some sort of credential for many jobs, right? For many things that you want to do in the world, you can't just go up and apply for it and say, hey, sign me up for this. Before they even let you through the door, you need to demonstrate that you hold some sort of credential, right? A degree, a diploma, something like this, right? In order to actually even have an opportunity to do that job. This would be an example of a social fact. It's external to you, but it has an extreme power over your life. If it didn't, chances are that many of you wouldn't be going to college in the first place. Now, social facts can also be thought of as social pressures, right? Things that have significant influence over us, which we don't really individually have the power to change. So we can think about different norms of polite discourse, norms of polite behavior, right? Whenever you enter into a public space, there's a set of expectations about what you are and are not allowed to do. These are things that almost nobody within that public space actually explicitly chose or consented to, but they're things that nevertheless weigh on us. A simple example would be there's that expectation that when you're out in public that you're dressed, that you're wearing clothes, right? This is something that as an individual you have very little chance of modifying this norm that to be out in public means you need to be clothed. But it's something that has a huge influence over how we conduct ourselves throughout the day. We can distinguish social facts from biological and physical imperatives. Right? There are certain things that are inherent to our biological existence. Right? Like, for example, the need to breathe, the need to drink water, the need to eat food. Right? There's all sorts of other things like this, which are pressures that we feel and things that impel our activity throughout the day, which are inherent to our biology. There are other things which are a part of the societies in which we grew up and in which we exist, which are not essential. Like, they could be different, and in various societies they take different forms. So we can think of the different sorts of laws, morals, beliefs, customs, and fashions, all of these different things that influence how people act, which are not universal, which are different when you go from one place to another, and which have changed over time, but which nevertheless are real constraints on what we're able to do. Now, Durkheim was the first major theorist of the school of sociology we call functionalism, which is a macro-sociological theory. Right? It looks at big picture, what in general is society about. Some of the things that characterize functionalism as a school of thought are the perspective that society is like a system, that our social world is like a dynamic network of interrelated parts. Right? Society is like a machine. You can think about it like it being a body, in which there are different organs and cells that have different jobs, or you can think of it like being a machine. Nowadays, the phrase that you're like a cog in a machine is seen as a negative thing. Right? That's seen as like a bad thing to be. No one wants to feel like they're just a cog in the machine. Right? In Durkheim's time, however, this was actually seen as a positive thing. Right? To be a part of something bigger than yourself, to be a part of something that was productive, meaningful, impactful, wasn't necessarily seen as being some negative thing that you wanted to avoid. The functionalists also have the point of view that society functions as a means. It's a way to help people fulfill their wants and desires. This is in total contradiction to what conflict theory presents. Conflict theory claims a lot of the features of society that we see around us are actually there to prevent us from getting what we want and to make it easier for others to take things from us. So this is a place where these two major schools of thought have diametrically opposed positions. The functionalists view society as being almost like a living thing. And when one part of society fails to work, just as when an organ fails, society as a whole experiences tremendous problems. Right? We all suffer if the social institutions of our society are not properly doing their job. Right? If the education system, for instance, is not providing adequate schooling, moral instruction, or other things like this that Durkheim believed to be essential to society's proper functioning, we all suffer the consequences. The functionalists consider society to be something like a provider, right? That in order for it to work, it has to meet the needs of the majority. And what functionalism allows us to do is to look at societies that are very different from the one that we might have grown up in or consider ourselves to be a part of. Societies which have very different morals, very different views on how people ought to operate in the world. And instead of just judging them for not adhering to the same morality or having the same value system as us, recognizing the way in which, even though it might not be what we're doing, nevertheless it still seems to work, at least for the majority of that population, maybe not for everyone. Durkheim says, man's characteristic privilege is that the bond he accepts is not physical, but moral. That is, social. He is governed not by a material environment brutally imposed on him, but by a conscience superior to his own, the superiority of which he feels. Because the greater, better part of his existence transcends the body, he escapes the body's yoke, but is subject to that of society. What Durkheim means here is that with the advent of modern civilization, modern industrialized civilization, we seem to have escaped many of the constraints that held back our ancestors, right? Very few of us really need to worry about starving to death. Some people, absolutely. But for most of us, we're not really worried about that. In fact, in our current society, the bigger concern for many of us is consuming too much, right? Similarly, many of the diseases that took the lives of many of our ancestors, many of the conditions that caused infants to die or mothers to die in childbirth, we've solved, or at least greatly minimized. The chief thing that controls us, that binds us, that restricts our existence, is not the dictates of nature, but the dictates of other human beings. The thing that we feel controlling us and preventing us from doing everything we might otherwise like to do is the social pressure of our culture. So here are a few functionalist premises. One is that society is made up of an array of interconnected structures, institutions. We can think of things like the education system, political systems, media systems. Now we would also think of social media systems. We would think of big tech institutions and other social facts. Another functionalist premise is that every structure meets some need of society, right? The fact that all of these things have survived over time is because they actually do something for us. Unlike the conflict theorists who would hold the perspective that pretty much all of these are in a conspiracy to hold us back, the functionalist point of view is that, well, they have to do something for us, otherwise they wouldn't carry on. They must contribute to social equilibrium to keep the peace in some way. Another functionalist premise is that the institutions we see around us have two different kinds of functions. They have intended consequences, which Durkheim refers to as manifest functions, as well as unintended consequences, which he calls latent functions. So we could think, for example, about the imposition of prohibition in the past, right? This was a major policy plank of progressives in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? Major political movements on the left believed that prohibition was one of the most important things we could do to improve social morality. What was found is that even if that may have been the intended effect of prohibition, right, to prevent people from drinking so they'd have better physical health and so they would be better, more moral people, it had a whole host of unintended consequences, namely an explosion of criminality, right, greater violence, greater pushback against the state. this was not what they thought. This was not what they had intended when they instituted prohibition. They didn't expect that this would lead to the explosion of organized crime. But that's exactly what happened. That creation of organized crime is the latent function of the imposition of prohibition. Now, there are a few different structural conditions that functionalists believe characterize each and every society. One is what they call social integration. So this is a characteristic that refers to the degree to which individuals feel connected to one another. So in a society with high social integration, you would look at your neighbors and feel, yes, we're in this together. You would look at your political representatives and say, yes, they speak for my interests. Or even if I disagree with them, they nevertheless still seem to be looking out for us. Another structural condition that functionalists identify is known as social regulation. This refers to the extent to which individual desires, behaviors, and emotions are regulated by society. We know that there are some desires, behaviors, and emotions which can be destructive. They can be destructive to individuals, and they can be destructive to organized groups or institutions. In well-regulated societies, the things that people want are things that can be obtained in a pro-social way. Right? People can feel fulfilled within their society. They can get what they need from it. In a society that is unregulated or dysregulated, people's desires, emotions, and behaviors are essentially out of whack. Things just aren't working. People are not able to get what they want and need within the confines of society. Social conventions, political institutions, economic institutions, etc., all for some reason are not contributing to, if not outright happiness, at least some sort of contentment or peacefulness or harmony. One of the things that can go wrong in a society that's gone off the rails is the proliferation of a condition that Durkheim calls anomie. Anomie refers to a state of normlessness. In other words, a situation where you don't really know what the right thing to do is anymore. This happens when a society, for one reason or another, does not give the members of that society clear goals. People don't know what they're supposed to work towards. People don't know what's possible. People are left adrift. And so people are left feeling tremendous confusion. This can also happen when a society fails to provide effective moral guidance. Durkheim is something of a moralist. He believes this is really what society should be focused on, is providing moral instruction. And things start to go wrong, he believes, if the society does not teach people to desire things and to value things that are pro-social, that match the desires of society as a whole. If people are wanting things that they cannot get except through violence or except through some other sort of disruption of social harmony, things have gone wrong. So this is a problem, right? Some of the consequences of anomie would be feelings like depression, perhaps turning to drug abuse, right? Think about what happens when you don't feel purpose or meaning in your life, where it feels like you're not working towards anything, where your actions don't seem to have a clear sort of goal, or you don't have the expectation that you'll get what you've been promised. In those situations, anomie results, and the consequences of that can be quite catastrophic. Now, we'll return to functionalist perspectives throughout the course. This is something we'll turn to again and again. but I want to just raise one critique that's made of Durkheim's perspective in particular. And this is from the great Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman's claim is that effectively what Durkheim does is he takes a Christian worldview, he abstracts God out of it and places society there instead. That this is not so much an accurate analysis of what society is, but an almost theological account of how things ought to be. And this is problematic because effectively Durkheim is saying that the social institutions and authority that impose restrictions upon us, that tell us what we can and cannot do, have the same power that previously human societies only attributed to the Lord of the universe. Is it actually right to give that power to other human beings? Right? At least in the theological perspective, if you are a Christian at least, there's this sense that God is omnipotent, omniscient, right? Omnibenevolent, right? He's all-loving, he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, and therefore the dictates that he has, the moral guidance that he provides, is just and true, right? If there's a being who knows everything, who is all-powerful and all-loving, it seems like it's probably a good idea to do what they say. If, on the other hand, our regulations are coming not from this perfect being, but from other flawed, imperfect, fallible human beings, there seems like there might be a problem. Functionalism is a theory we'll return to throughout this semester, but this is a basic overview of what its ideas entail.